It's 2:30 in the morning in a quiet residential neighborhood in Luxembourg City. Inside a modest apartment, the steady hum of machinery cuts through the silence. The sound has been going for hours, every night for weeks. The elderly neighbor downstairs has had enough. Franklin Jurado doesn't hear the complaint being filed 3 floors below. He's too focused on the neat stacks of European currency feeding through his money-counting machine. The Harvard-educated economist sits surrounded by financial documents, bank statements from 68 different banks scattered across his coffee table. Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Monaco, 9 countries in total. The machine keeps counting. What Jurado doesn't know is that Luxembourg police have just received new powers under the country's freshly passed anti-money laundering laws. What he also doesn't know is that across town, a Monaco bank has just collapsed, and auditors are discovering suspicious accounts that all trace back to one name: Franklin Jurado. 2 months later, the machine falls silent. At 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Luxembourg police break down his door. They find him in his pajamas, the apartment littered with evidence of one of history's most sophisticated money laundering operations. Bank account numbers scrawled on napkins, wire transfer receipts stuffed in coffee cans, and most damning of all, detailed computer records documenting exactly how he moved $36 million in drug profits through more than 100 bank accounts across Europe. The mild-mannered academic, who should have been teaching economics to Harvard undergraduates, had instead become the financial architect for José Santa Cruz Londoño, the third most powerful man in Colombia's notorious Cali Cartel. But as police would soon discover, Franklin Jurado wasn't just any money launderer. He was a glimpse into a much darker truth about the global financial system, one where the world's most prestigious banks didn't just accidentally enable drug money laundering, they actively profited from it. This is the story of how a Harvard PhD almost perfected the art of making blood money look clean, and how a noisy neighbor's complaint brought down a scheme that would have funded cartel operations for decades to come. But more than that, it's the story of how the very institutions trusted to safeguard the global economy became the cartel's most valuable accomplices. To understand Franklin Jurado's audacious scheme, we must first see why drug cartels need bankers, and why the global financial system is their ideal laundromat. Money laundering unfolds in 3 stages. 1. Placement. Freshly trafficked cash must enter the banking system without raising red flags. 2. Layering. Successive transfers obscure the money's illicit origin, ideally moving it through multiple banks, countries, and accounts. 3. Integration. The cleaned funds re-enter the legitimate economy as investment capital, business revenue, or personal wealth. Each year, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimates the global drug trade generates hundreds of billions in cash profits. According to UNODC's 2025 World Drug Report, 316 million people used illicit drugs in 2023, fueling a market that literally piles cash up in cartel safehouses across multiple continents. That money can't simply sit in a mattress. It needs to look legitimate. Enter the private banker, a trusted financial professional who can open accounts, craft convincing paperwork, and navigate reporting thresholds. Far from the street-level money couriers of old, modern cartels hire Ivy League-trained economists and wealth managers to engineer their invisibility. Behind the lobby doors of Europe's most prestigious banks, drug cash becomes just another balance on a client's statements. Sophisticated shell companies, bearer shares, and a web of cross-border transfers all serve to hide the trail. Profits that once fueled violence on Colombia's streets emerge as corporate dividends in Zurich, rental income in Rome, or retirement funds in Luxembourg. But this system relies on a simple fact: banks make money on transaction fees and deposits. For too many institutions, that incentive outweighed compliance. When millions in drug profits flowed through major banks, punitive fines loomed large, but jail time for executives remained remote. The result? Cartels could buy banking expertise as easily as they purchased weapons. Franklin Jurado was hired not for muscle, but for his mind. He understood that the cleanest way to hide dirty money was to make it indistinguishable from legitimate wealth. And to do that, he didn't need to break vaults or bribe tellers. He only needed to outthink the system they believed kept them safe. In the late 1980s, José Santa Cruz Londoño faced a problem that violence couldn't solve. The third-ranking leader of Colombia's Cali Cartel was drowning in cash. Literally. His cocaine operations in the United States generated millions in small bills that piled up in Panamanian bank vaults, but dirty money sitting in accounts was useless money. He needed someone who could make it disappear into the legitimate financial system and reappear as clean investment capital. What he needed wasn't another Sicario or street enforcer. He needed a Harvard-trained economist. The unlikely criminal, Franklin Jurado, didn't look like a typical cartel associate. The soft-spoken Colombian had earned his undergraduate degree in economics from Harvard University, then completed graduate work at Columbia University's prestigious economics department. While his classmates went on to work for Wall Street firms or international development organizations, Jurado returned to Colombia with a different plan. By 1987, he had caught the attention of Santa Cruz Londoño through family connections and professional reputation. The Cali Cartel had always prided itself on being more sophisticated than their rivals, the Medellin Cartel. While Pablo Escobar relied on bombs and assassinations, the Cali leadership preferred bribery, corruption, and financial innovation. They recruited lawyers, accountants, and economists the same way other cartels recruited gunmen. The perfect resume. Jurado brought exactly what Santa Cruz Londoño needed: an Ivy League education that opened doors in international banking, fluency in multiple languages that allowed him to operate across Europe, and, most critically, an understanding of complex financial instruments that could render drug profits invisible to investigators. His academic training in mathematical economics made him uniquely qualified to design layered financial schemes. He understood derivatives, currency exchanges, offshore banking regulations, and reporting thresholds. More importantly, he looked the part of a legitimate European businessman, well-dressed, articulate, credentialed. To European bankers, Jurado appeared to be exactly what he claimed: a successful Colombian entrepreneur diversifying his investments across European markets. His Harvard diploma and professional demeanor opened accounts that would have remained closed to obvious criminal associates. In 1987, Santa Cruz Londoño offered Jurado a proposition. The Cali Cartel had approximately $36 million in cocaine profits sitting in Panamanian banks, generating suspicion but no legitimate returns. Could Jurado's financial expertise transform this liability into an asset? For Jurado, the offer represented both enormous financial reward and intellectual challenge. Here was an opportunity to apply cutting-edge economic theory to solve a real-world problem, even if that problem happened to be concealing the proceeds of international drug trafficking. He accepted, and over the next 3 years would construct what investigators later called one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations in criminal history. The mild-mannered academic was about to become the financial architect of one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. But first, he had to figure out how to make $36 million in drug money vanish completely into the European banking system and then reappear as legitimate business investment back in Colombia. To launder $36 million in 3 years, Franklin Jurado orchestrated a financial masterpiece in 3 movements: placement, layering, and integration. Introducing dirty cash to Europe. Cartel cash proceeds from U.S. cocaine sales were physically transported to Panama. In Panama City, associates deposited small sums, always under $10,000, into local bank accounts to avoid mandatory reporting. From Panama, funds moved by wire transfer to shell companies in Europe, appearing as legitimate business transactions. A maze of 68 banks across 9 countries. Jurado opened accounts in 68 separate banks spanning Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Luxembourg, Monaco, and the UK. He registered accounts in the names of José Santa Cruz's relatives, mistresses, and fictitious European personas, ensuring no single identity held more than $10,000 at a time. Constant movement between accounts, sometimes multiple times per day, created an audit trail so convoluted it baffled compliance officers. Offshore shell companies, including Panamanian corporations and Monaco holding companies, lent a veneer of legitimacy. Re-importing clean money to Colombia. Once washed, funds were wired back to Colombia as capital investments. Jurado established legitimate enterprises, restaurants in Bogotá, a pharmacy chain, and a small construction firm, through which laundered money flowed as reported revenue. Cartel leaders reinvested earnings into real estate and development projects, cementing their wealth within Colombia's formal economy. Key techniques and safeguards. Kept transactions below the European reporting threshold to evade suspicious activity reports. Jurado's team maintained stacks of falsified identification documents, marriage certificates, and corporate charters. By moving money within and between jurisdictions rapidly, they exploited time zone differences and limited cross-border monitoring. Luxembourg and Monaco's strict banking secrecy laws insulated transactions from U.S. and Colombian regulators. In 3 years, Jurado transformed $36 million in high-risk cartel cash into seemingly legitimate corporate assets. By the time authorities discovered the scheme, the money had already circulated through nearly every major European financial center and funded a network of legitimate businesses that masked its criminal origin. But as we'll see next, even this symphony of transactions had a fatal flaw. One noisy neighbor and new anti-money laundering laws would bring the entire operation crashing down. Franklin Jurado was an individual genius, but he operated within a wider system that often looked the other way. Two of the world's largest banks illustrate how institutional incentives enabled cartel finance on a massive scale. Investigations revealed that from 2004 to 2007, Wachovia processed roughly $378 billion in wire transfers originating from Mexican currency exchange houses known to handle cartel cash. Drug traffickers designed custom cash boxes that fit precisely into Wachovia teller windows, depositing millions in small bills under reporting thresholds. Despite internal warnings, Wachovia allowed the transactions to continue, ultimately paying a $160 million fine and forfeiting $110 million in illicit proceeds, without facing criminal charges against executives. Between 2002 and 2010, HSBC's Mexican subsidiary moved $881 million for the Sinaloa and Norte del Valle cartels, often under the codename Altamira in bank records. Recorded cartel emails boasted HSBC was the place to go for laundering, thanks to lax oversight and the ability to maintain accounts in high-risk regions. In 2012, HSBC pleaded guilty to U.S. money laundering charges and paid a record $1.9 billion fine, the largest forfeiture against a bank at that time. Yet no senior executives went to prison. Banks earn fees on every transaction, millions in fines, while hefty or minor compared to annual profits. Prosecutors often settle with fines rather than pursue executives, leaving corporate cultures unchanged. Complex cross-border rules and banking secrecy laws in jurisdictions like Switzerland and Luxembourg allowed large flows of opaque funds to persist. By the time Franklin Jurado's records surfaced in 1990, these institutional failures had already shown that banks could facilitate vast laundering schemes with minimal consequence. Jurado was a pioneer, but the world's biggest banks quickly proved they could outdo even his layered masterwork. The full scope of how deeply drug money had penetrated the global financial system only became clear during the 2008 financial crisis, when a shocking confession emerged from the highest levels of international law enforcement.
This is not your ordinary run-of-the-mill recession. We are going through the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression.
In January 2009, just months after the global banking system nearly collapsed, Antonio Maria Costa, head of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, made a statement that sent shockwaves through financial circles. Speaking from his Vienna office, Costa revealed that he had seen evidence that proceeds from organized crime were the only liquid investment capital available to some banks on the brink of collapse. Interbank loans were funded by money that originated from the drugs trade and other illegal activities, Costa stated. There were signs that some banks were rescued that way. Costa's investigation revealed the staggering magnitude magnitude of criminal money flowing through the system. $352 billion in drug profits were absorbed into the economic system during 2008. When legitimate interbank lending froze up, drug money became the primary source of liquidity for struggling financial institutions. Banks that should have collapsed were instead rescued by cartel cash. The money didn't just prop up small regional banks, it flowed through major international institutions. The mechanics were brutally simple. By late 2008, banks had stopped lending to each other due to fears about toxic assets and creditworthiness. Legitimate capital markets had essentially frozen. Drug cartels, flush with billions in cash profits, became eager lenders to desperate banks. Unlike legitimate investors, cartels didn't ask hard questions about balance sheets or require detailed due diligence. Banks classified these inflows as private deposits or offshore investments, while regulators, focused on preventing total system collapse, looked the other way. When Costa's revelations became public, the response was telling. No major banking executives faced criminal prosecution for accepting cartel money during the crisis. Regulatory authorities focused on fines rather than jail time for institutional enablers. The phrase "too big to fail" evolved into "too big to jail." Major banks were considered too systemically important to face serious criminal consequences. The 2008 crisis revealed the ultimate paradox of the global financial system. While Franklin Jurado went to prison for laundering $36 million over 3 years, major international banks processed hundreds of billions in drug money and faced only financial penalties. The individual genius was crushed by the system, while the institutions that enabled crime on an industrial scale continued operating with minimal consequences. As Costa put it, banks have allowed the world's criminal economy to become part of the global economy. The financial crisis had proven that when the chips were down, the global banking system didn't just tolerate drug money, it actively depended on it for survival. By spring 1990, Franklin Jurado's laundering network was humming along flawlessly, until a simple noise complaint set off a chain reaction that would bring the entire operation crashing down. For months, Jurado had been working late into the night in his Luxembourg apartment, feeding cash through a high-speed money-counting machine. One elderly neighbor filed repeated complaints with building management. Luxembourg had just enacted stringent anti-money laundering legislation. Police were on heightened alert for suspicious financial activity. In late April 1990, prosecutors obtained a search warrant for Jurado's apartment, citing noise complaints as the pretext to investigate potential money laundering under the new law. Simultaneously, judges authorized wiretaps on Jurado's phone lines and surveillance of his European shell companies. Investigators intercepted calls between Jurado and cartel associates in Panama and Bogota, confirming the flow of illicit funds into his European accounts. June 12, 1990. At dawn, Luxembourg police, accompanied by financial crime investigators, stormed Jurado's third-floor flat. They found a state-of-the-art money counter still running, red light blinking, bank statements and wire transfers receipts from 68 banks in 9 countries, computer printouts documenting every transaction over the previous 3 years, a coffee can stuffed with bearer share certificates and falsified IDs. Jurado was arrested in his pajamas, stunned by the scale of the evidence arrayed around him. Simultaneous raids in Monaco and Austria froze over $30 million in cartel-linked accounts. Luxembourg prosecutors shared intelligence with U.S. and Colombian authorities, triggering international investigations. Jurado's meticulous paper trails, intended to hide the money's origin, became incontrovertible proof of laundering. Faced with overwhelming evidence and wiretap transcripts, Jurado ceased denying his role. He cooperated with investigators, revealing the identities behind phantom accounts and the mechanics of the 3-year scheme. By mid-1990, the once invisible Harvard economist had become the most notorious money launderer in European history, and a cautionary tale of how even the most sophisticated criminal enterprise can collapse under the weight of its own meticulous record-keeping. After Franklin Jurado's dramatic arrest in June 1990, the wheels of international justice moved deliberately, spanning multiple jurisdictions before eventually delivering final verdicts and sentences. The journey from capture to conviction unfolded over several years, revealing the magnitude of Jurado's operations and the reach of authorities determined to bring him to account. In 1992, Jurado faced his first trial in Luxembourg. He was charged with violations of Luxembourg's anti-money laundering statutes, accused of operating a sophisticated financial laundering network and falsifying documents to cover his tracks. The trial was convened in Luxembourg City's district court, where prosecutors presented compelling evidence from the apartment raid, extensive bank freezes, and wiretap transcripts that detailed the scope of the operation. Ultimately, the court found Jurado guilty on all counts related to money laundering and document forgery. He was sentenced to a 4-year prison term, with credit for time already served since his arrest in June 1990. Once Jurado completed his sentence in Luxembourg, new legal proceedings awaited him. In 1994, U.S. prosecutors in Brooklyn filed an extradition request, citing Jurado's key role in laundering narcotics proceeds for the Cali Cartel under U.S. money laundering statutes. Luxembourg's Ministry of Justice approved the U.S. request, and after finishing his time in Luxembourg, Jurado was extradited, arriving in New York in late 1994 to face federal prosecution. In January 1995, a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of New York indicted Jurado under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956 for money laundering and various related conspiracy counts. Presented with overwhelming documentary evidence and wiretap transcripts, Jurado ultimately pleaded guilty in April 1996 to laundering over $30 million in cartel funds. U.S. District Judge agreed to a 7.5-year prison term, which ran concurrently with the remaining Luxembourg time. Jurado was also ordered to forfeit $30 million in corresponding assets. In the course of investigations, Jurado cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced sentencing exposure. He supplied detailed account ledgers and identified the bank branches and shell companies that facilitated the laundering scheme. As a result, authorities across Luxembourg, Monaco, Austria, and the U.S. succeeded in freezing and repatriating approximately $30 million of the original $36 million. Yet, even years later, investigators managed to uncover additional Jurado-linked accounts in the Channel Islands and Swiss banks, suggesting that several million more remained hidden and unaccounted for. For Jurado's co-conspirators, the aftermath varied. José Santa Cruz Londoño was captured and killed in a 1996 police shootout in Bogotá, never standing trial for money laundering. Other intermediaries and shell company controllers faced lesser charges in Europe, with most serving short sentences before quietly returning to private life. In response to the revelations, Luxembourg and neighboring jurisdictions strengthened banking secrecy reforms, introduced stricter due diligence requirements, and joined the Financial Action Task Force. By 1996, Franklin Jurado had served his terms on both sides of the Atlantic, and much of the cartel's illicit wealth had been seized. Yet, despite the conviction of this individual mastermind, the larger institutional failures that enabled his scheme went largely unpunished. Bank executives continued to profit, regulatory gaps persisted, and the cartels simply found new private bankers to take his place. Franklin Jurado's case highlights a perennial paradox in the world of financial crime. While the lone genius is pursued and punished with harsh justice, the colossal institutions enabling industrial-scale laundering often escape with little more than fines. The contrast is stark, and it raises uncomfortable questions about accountability. When comparing the scale of operations and consequences, the divide becomes clear. Jurado himself laundered $36 million across 68 banks, and for this, he received a 7.5-year prison sentence and forfeited $30 million. In contrast, major financial institutions like Wachovia Bank were implicated in $378 billion in cartel transfers, yet their penalty was $160 million fine and a $110 million forfeiture. HSBC processed $881 million for Mexican cartels, walking away with a $1.9 billion fine and no executive jail sentences. TD Bank faced a $3 billion fine for cartel-related flows, but resolved their legal troubles through settlement without a single criminal conviction. Why do institutions so often escape real consequences? Profit incentives play a major role. Banks earn substantial fees on each transaction, and even record-breaking fines remain a mere fraction of their annual revenues. The concept of being too big to jail leads prosecutors to prioritize systemic stability over prosecuting executives, resulting in deferred or non-prosecution agreements. Regulatory loopholes further protect these entities, with jurisdictional gaps and banking secrecy laws, especially in Europe and offshore havens, providing fertile ground for sophisticated launderers. All the while, individual investigators can only dismantle one operation at a time, as cartels continue to recruit new bankers and exploit system complexity. The human cost of this imbalance is impossible to ignore. Jurado's conviction led to recovery of only part of the cartel's $36 million. Tens of millions remain hidden, fueling ongoing cartel violence through unseized profits. Legitimate businesses suffer too, enduring reputational damage and, in some cases, bankruptcy as a result of undetected laundering schemes. Several enduring lessons emerge from Jurado's downfall. Compliance alone isn't enough. Regulatory frameworks must anticipate sophisticated layering tactics, not just flag large transfers. The battle between transparency and secrecy continues, and stronger registries of beneficial ownership, alongside cross-border cooperation, are essential for tracing the true owners behind shell companies. Most importantly, institutional accountability must match individual accountability. Without this, the cycle of corruption and crime will only perpetuate. In the end, Franklin Jurado's meticulous records were enough to collapse a major laundering network. But the banks that processed hundreds of billions for cartels remain largely untouched at the executive level. This systemic imbalance only reinforces a troubling reality. The rules are harsher for individuals than for institutions. And until that changes, the machinery of financial crime will keep grinding on. As Franklin Jurado faded from the headlines, the financial world forged ahead, seemingly unchanged. Yet the echoes of his intricate money laundering scheme continue to resonate to this day. Where are the key players now? Jurado himself was released around the year 2000, disappearing from public view with his family. He briefly resurfaced in 2012, quietly working in Spain and managing small businesses, while his European bank accounts remained sealed and largely unrecovered. José Santa Cruz Londoño, meanwhile, met a violent end in a 1996 shootout, never facing trial for his role in money laundering. On the institutional front, banks like Wachovia and HSBC paid hefty fines, but no executives served jail time. TD Bank's $3 billion settlement in 2024 only reaffirmed this persistent pattern of institutional survival. Across the industry, an ironic continuity persists. The cycle remains unbroken. As soon as one private banker falls, another steps into the void. Major banks continue to process suspicious cash flows, regarding fines as nothing more than a predictable cost of doing business. While regulations have tightened under the Financial Action Task Force, new laundering techniques, ranging from cryptocurrencies to sophisticated trade-based schemes, constantly evolve, keeping regulators on the defensive. There is, ultimately, a final irony. Franklin Jurado, a Harvard-educated economist once celebrated for his intellectual rigor, became a cautionary tale, proof that elite knowledge, when misused, can empower violent crime. The loud hum of his money-counting machine, intended to conceal illicit wealth, instead exposed a labyrinth of global banking failures. Jurado himself was punished, but the enormous institutions that facilitated cartel operations escaped with token fines, walking away unscathed. The cat-and-mouse game between financial criminals and regulators endures, and the balance still tips in favor of those with the deepest pockets and most complex systems. Franklin Jurado's story is far more than a historical footnote. It remains a stark reminder that, while human ingenuity may outpace any system, lasting reform will only come when both individuals and the financial giants they serve are held equally accountable.